My name is Lisa Khachaturian. I'm here to present on my book, originally my dissertation, on the history of the formation of modern Eastern Armenian identity. It came out last year by Transaction Publishers. So first I want to thank the University of Michigan Armenian Studies program for inviting me to come talk to you this afternoon. In particular, I want to extend a very big thank you to Dr. Libaritian. As he said, he's the special editor of the Transaction Publishers Armenian Studies series. I was really able to get my work published because of his support and his editorial input, so thank you very much. And thanks also to Professor Suni and Bardakjan and Ingrid Peterson of the Armenian Studies program. Okay. Now, the focus of my study. Often we think of modern Armenian history, especially starting from the early 19th century, as the most when we think of modern Armenian history, we think of the most prominent events and figures. And those that come to mind are usually those related to national revival and the intellectuals, the literati, the writers, the thinkers, that made modern Armenian culture possible. They formulated and popularized modern Armenian language, culture, and history. Now, there's a good reason for this. They're crucial for modern Armenian nationhood, and they've received a great deal of attention in the historiography on Armenia. For example, when we think of the vernacular, colloquial language that we speak, or our general understanding of ourselves and our history as Armenians, in good part comes from these literati. So, for example, this image here is of Raphael Batganyan. It's on a stamp commemorating his birth in Armenia in 2005. He is considered sort of a household name, which some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Now, one important caveat I should mention, I look at the communities in the Caucasus and the Russian Empire. So there was, of course, a very important cultural flourishing going on in parallel in the Ottoman Empire, but that's beyond the scope of my research. So there's a variety of ways that these intellectuals and their political movements have been portrayed. For example, they have been portrayed as liberal bourgeoisie, national conservatives, progressive socialist come revolutionaries, liberal westernizers, you name it. But whether as revolutionaries or anti-clerical social activists, all of them were considered deeply nationalist, which again is not a surprise because that is their most important characteristic. Now, the problem is that there's a tendency in Armenian historiography to provide an overly deterministic understanding of nation and national identity. Now, these labels, revolutionary and whatnot, aren't in and of themselves meaningful terms. Even the underlying foundational word identifying these intellectuals as nationalist is itself a circular concept. Nationalist is both a powerful noun and adjective because the cause and effect, the agency, is often assumed in the word itself. So as a noun, it is an advocate or believer in nationalism. As an adjective, it means of, relating to, or advocating nationalism. So one can get away with not really having to look too deeply into the motivations of the nationalist. So what I tried to do is I tried to get away from the general idea that there's something intuitive about being a nationalist. There was, in fact, in place an educational system, a scholarship that motivated the literati that I encountered in my research. So I offer an assessment, a reassessment of the literati by asking the following types of questions. How did they perceive their role in the modern national movement? What specifically informed their sense of national identity? And what caused them to question the status quo? Really, that's the main question. And in connecting the various historiographical trends together, the English, Russian language, Armenian, Soviet works on the 19th century intelligentsia and the press, I examined this generation of Armenian literati not as direct precursors to the revolutionary movement, extensively covered in the Soviet history books, but as a group with their own influences and ideas. So I tried to look beyond the labels and not make assumptions of their works, but rather I question what motivated them by looking at their own words. So a great deal in my book actually has direct translated quotes from what they had to say in their publications. Now, it's not to say that these terms aren't in and of themselves valid. What I've tried to do in my research is look at some of the key movements that shaped 19th century intellectuals, namely the Enlightenment and modernity, and not to look at nationalism as a first cause, but as a consequence, as I said, of other factors, by looking at their biographies, the realities of Russian colonization in all its various forms that brought essentially European intellectual influences into the Caucasus, namely Oriental studies, which is called Vostokovedenie, studies of the East. The primary sources I looked at, there were at least 59 Armenian periodicals that were published throughout the 19th century, starting as early as 1815 in Astrakhan, over an 85-year period throughout the Caucasus till 1901. So this 59 number is actually from 1815 to 1901, and these periodicals covered a very broad geographical sweep. So the four that I chose to focus on are as listed here, starting from 1858, ending essentially in the turn of the century. QC Sapile is Stepanos Nazarian's publication, the main person I'll focus on today. Mashak is Grigor Artsruni's edited work. It was one of the longest running periodicals. Pords and Murj are both considered thick journals, which are essentially intellectual works that included a lot of translated literature, information on politics. So they were actually very thick journals, sort of like textbooks. Journalism itself in this period was a cornerstone of 19th century Armenian intellectual life. The press was more than just a means of reporting news. These journals were the leading forum for airing ideas and for debating critical issues affecting Armenian life. And so what I offer isn't so much a history of the press. For example, I make no attempt to look at the reading public. I actually focus on my chosen journals as a forum through which I can view how an emerging intelligentsia expressed their attitudes and discuss what they believed were important questions on modern history, society, culture of their day. And moreover, the press itself is a new technology. It's a tool, an agent of change that allowed these disparate intellectuals to communicate with one another. I mean, there were journals in Astrakhan, New Nakhichevan, Echmiadzin, Tiflis, St. Petersburg, Moscow. So there was this very sort of wide, broad network, and these journals were reading each other's works. So that's really the focus. Now, very briefly, the setting. As you all know, this is a modern map of the Commonwealth of Independent States with all the sovereign borders. Now, we look at the Caucasus region itself more closely. The South Caucasus is, of course, a region with a very turbulent history, overwhelmed with centuries of warfare that promoted shifting allegiances, fluctuating territorial boundaries, and it was perpetually subject to the control of dominant powers. It's a natural zone of competition, an ideal access route linking Middle Eastern, European, and Russian trade. It has a very mountainous terrain that offered a secure buffer zone between the warring hegemonic powers, namely the Ottoman, Persian, and later the Russian empires. So therefore, this cultural, linguistic, and religious diversity of the region ensured deep internal divisions and forced its inhabitants to look constantly in opposing directions for aid from larger, more powerful neighbors. And as you can see this color-coded map, you have the various language families represented in a relatively small geographic space. So what did this endemic diversity look like in the 19th century? After a series of military conquests in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Russia gained a durable southern frontier, and this diverse region was contained within the borders of a single government. So this map of the 19th century Caucasus shows that, how it was part of the empire, and it was divided in administrative units, not separate sovereign states. So in some ways, I think, Armenians reflected especially well the diversity of this territory, as they lived in dispersed communities throughout the Caucasus and already in the 19th century throughout the Russian Empire. Yet whatever their diversity, Armenians maintained a vision of ethno-religious particularity, historical legends, a clerical hierarchy centered in Echmiadzin that expressed, quote, persistent belief that Armenians are one no matter where they are. So there's a key tension here. In practice, you have a flexibility of very rich Armenian customs and diverse linguistic dialects that are contrasting with very rigid symbols of religious unity. And these communities, with their diverse local practices, had loosely coexisted for centuries after the demise of Armenian statehood, with a common allegiance to the Armenian church and to the clerical hierarchy, the Katholikos, the Catholicos. But these local differences, as I'm trying to point out, became much more obvious in the 19th century with the Russian conquest. Essentially, a centralized power imposed Enlightenment learning, which is scientific, critical analysis, and compelled these communities to adapt to standardized notions of identity, of a modern language, common historical narrative, and a verifiable history, one of the most important points. So the integration of the Caucasus into the Russian Empire and the empire's recruitment of non-Russians, in this case Armenians, into the Russian educational system triggered a new phase in modern understanding of Armenian national identity. That's my argument ultimately. And the end result is an Armenian literati that began to measure its success as a nation using the yardstick of European social scientific methods, and concluded that their numerous settlements scattered across the empire were fatally inadequate. And you see this type of language pervasively in these periodicals. So this is essentially their literati's platform. Their primary focus became cultural revival. The literati became convinced that Armenians lacked cultural awareness critical for survival in the modern world. Their concern really was expressed in very sort of pressing existential questions. The dominance of the outdated classical Armenian language, the Garapar, developed by the clerical elite, was preventing the advent of a national literature because most Armenians could not understand this ancient language. They insisted that Armenians required a renovated vernacular, an ashkarapar, that would be accessible to all. That's part of their platform. So as they grappled with modernity, they also challenged the traditional conventions of their classical historical canon, primarily this 5th century handed down tradition. So they sought in this area not only to create a usable past, but also a means of quantifying and qualifying their present social life. And they did this through history, a whole variety of disciplines: history, ethnography, travel, literature, statistics, local history, all of this represented in the press. In addition, they pointed to a religious leadership that was far removed from their contemporary social reality and the lack of a native educational infrastructure capable of cultivating cultural consciousness. All of this was hindering the development of a common ethnic identity. So that's the problem created by the impact of Russian colonization entry into the Caucasus. Now, one effective way, I believe, of understanding this process of integration is through biography. This is actually a portrait of Garegin Levonyan, one of these 19th century literati. He was a specialist on Armenian periodicals in the printing press. In fact, he came out with, I believe, one of the first extensive bibliographies from 1794 to 1894, basically an inventory of the periodical press, of all Armenian language periodicals. It was published in 1895 and then later reprinted in 1934. So you can see he's sitting around leisurely reading various volumes and newspapers, and you can't really make it out there, but what he's reading is Nordar, which is New Century, one of these journals that came out in 1883. I think he's sort of a classic quintessential image of the 19th century literati. Now, although my book includes a whole circle of Armenian literati, I want to mention one in particular, Stepanos Nazarian, who is an Armenian Journal editor and Orientalist scholar. Not only because I focus on him a great deal in my book, but because many people familiar with the 19th century revival often think of people like Khachaturian and his work Wounds of Armenia, Verkayastani, or Mikhail Nalbandian's patriotic poems and prose. But we rarely think of Nazarian, who was actually a very close friend and mentor and collaborator and eventual colleague of Mikhail Nalbandian. And moreover, I believe that Nazarian really exemplifies how Armenian identity and the national revival was impacted by Russian colonization of the Caucasus. The educational and professional opportunities he had were a direct result of the changes taking place in the Caucasus in the 19th century. So this is actually a portrait of Nazarian. He was born in 1812 and died in 1879. So his life spans from the first to the last of the Russo-Turkish wars of the 19th century. His parents emigrated from Khoi, Persia, in the early 1900s, and along with his friend Khachaturian, he was among the first to attend the newly opened Nersisian school in Tiflis, Tbilisi, which opened its doors in 1824. So he's really the first entering class of this school. That's really initially where he was exposed to Russian and European literature. As a young adult, he was exposed to, he was actually in the Caucasus for the Treaty of Turkmenchai, which took place in 1828, I'm sure many of you know, which is really the current day borders of Armenia and Iran, the Arax River, essentially. So it's remained to this day. He was one of the first students to enter the gymnasium and the university in Dorpat, which is all the way up in the north in the Baltic republics in current day Estonia. In his adulthood, from 1833 to 1849, he moved through most stages of the imperial educational system. He was after Dorpat, he went to St. Petersburg University. There was a professor's institute that was founded there by a number of his mentors, which were primarily German and European, German and French, Orientalist scholars that were given funding to start a professor's institute, which was a training for Orientalist scholars. He studied there for a year, wrote a thesis on Athens and Sparta in Russian. He then moved to Kazan University. He was secured a placement in the newly opened Oriental Institute in Kazan, which eventually was sort of became one of the primary focus and one of the richest libraries for Oriental studies. And then he moved to the Nazarian Institute in Moscow, where he taught for the rest of his life. So apart from 1 year where he returned to Tiflis to become a rector of the Nersisian school later on, he spent primarily most of his adult life in outside of the Caucasus. Another, I think, interesting point is that he was so plugged into this educational system, this Russian imperial educational system. He originally wanted to be a medical student and transferred his field of study to philosophy because he received a stipend, and he knew he was promised that he would receive a stipend if he followed that path. And so that's what he did. And then eventually sort of repaid his service in kind and to the government by teaching for 6 years. So that was a program that was in place. And that's part of this whole reform of the educational system in the Russian Empire that took place starting from Alexander I, that really was centered under the leadership of Count Uvarov in the 1830s in the university statute. So he was sort of benefited from these transformations. So what's interesting, I think, about Nazarian isn't so much the fact that he was a nationalist activist. It's how he argued for change in Armenian society and Armenian leadership. It's the logic behind his argument and how he established a reputation as a nationalist intellectual on the one hand among his ethnic peers, while simultaneously earning a career in the Russian imperial civil service. So this duality is very interesting, I think, because clearly he is someone who's very integrated into the imperial system, yet at the same time is a nationalist scholar. So he's simultaneously within the state sphere of influence and at its margins. So there are actually two key articles of faith that defined Nazarian's thinking. The first is his belief in the fundamental truths of the Enlightenment, as I said, brought in to Russia and the Caucasus by way of European scholars. The second, which I'll explore a little bit, both of these. The first is this truth in the Enlightenment. The second is his belief in the need for a total reform of the Armenian Apostolic Church. So what I see happening in the mid-19th century is simultaneously a reformation and enlightenment that's going on among the Armenian literati, which I think is very interesting. So the first platform, the articles he published throughout his life really questioned, under the guise of this Enlightenment spirit of critical questioning, what are the fundamental factors that connect the individual to society? What binds people together? What are the foundations of Armenian society, and how do they compare to European social ideals? Why do Armenian communities lack the secular, self-sufficient intermediary social institutions? I mean, these are some of the questions that I sort of reduced down from my reading of his various articles. And I think what he was really trying to do was to develop a working political philosophy. And he has a couple of very key articles in relation to that, which I can look up if anybody's interested. And then, as I said, he didn't do this by coincidence. His struggle for sort of existential epistemological certainty came from the humanities and classical philological training that he has. So, for example, some of the works that he translated Herder, which, is one of the key thinkers of, thought and language in the vernacular. Is really thought would not be possible without a vernacular language. The most effective means of really affirming cultural and contemporary authenticity of a people is through the vernacular language. He was a strong proponent of that. He translated Rousseau, Karamzin, Zhukovsky, a lot of the, key sort of intellectual translators or founders of sort of Russian vernacular tradition, like Pushkin, Karamzin. He was very interested in all of these people. So he didn't take this question of updating Armenian culture and society under sort of Enlightenment thinking. I mean, he really took this idea of who are we as a people and how can we account for our contemporary reality. So I'd like to read you a brief quote that really, I think, expresses this well. So he wrote this actually there's a collected letters, correspondences that he had. So he says, quote, "If the Armenian people, with unified caution and the greatest effort, cannot improve this difficult present, they will generate an even greater and inconsolable future. If there are a few sparks of life in the nation, the Azg, let its ingenuity give them the heart and hand to rouse and inspire. If not, it is inevitable that voracious Cronus will devour and wear us down as the worthless children of time." So there's a real pressing sort of feel in his writing. And, just another quote. He says, "Living in time, we must exist together with and for it. We must serve time attentively, keep pace with its steps, so that it does not destroy us as latecomers. To serve time not as slaves, but as rulers. Europe has taken great pains to establish its tradition and is inviting us to participate in it. We should hasten to take this offer. Otherwise, the insatiable Cronus will swallow us up as the spoiled children of time." So you can imagine there's a lot of quotes like this. So this is really the challenge of historicism and modern social sciences entering into his way of thinking. One way that he was able to use this learning and aim his critique at the Armenian tradition is he actually was a prolific writer. Before starting Husisapile in 1858, he published for a period of over a decade a series of monographs and educational textbooks. And two of them, I think one, actually his first two were published, one in 1844 entitled A Brief Sketch of the History of Armenian Literature until the end of the 13th century. The second, in 1846, is A Survey of the History of Armenian Literature in Contemporary Era. So this was actually a guidebook. It was an inventory of all Armenian works that he could find translated in Russian. And so I think that he was really documenting these works to try to, show what's available and then to critique it at the same time. And he actually he did the same thing with the Mkhitaryi scholars. He really believed that they were the initial founders of this Armenian tradition, yet they were outdated and needed, a new leadership sort of to start delving into and researching Armenian history, but he had an idea, actually, it came out in his letters, of founding a Mkhitarist center in Kazan University while he was teaching there. So the Enlightenment historicism is sort of one pillar. The second, which I'll go over very quickly, is the total reform of the Apostolic Church. And here his training in Dorpat and his belief in Protestant theology and pietism really comes through. What he did was locate the primary evidence of divinity in Scripture, not in religious institutions, not in the church. So when you separate, religion and faith from church as an organization, you are able to look at this organization in temporal terms and track its history. And his assessment was that ultimately when you look at the church as a social organization that is there to meet the needs of its people, the church was woefully inadequate. And so I think this is actually, very Protestant way of looking at things. So he called the church disembodied symbols of worship. For example, he called it a golden throne, quote, icons made of wood and stone covering a tarnished organism, a rotting foundation, a barren and empty desert. So there's a whole host of really fundamental criticisms he makes of the church. And really what he was hoping to do was, through the distribution of his journal of Husisapile, was to compete with the Armenian Apostolic Church's symbolic authority. And he, in his journal, elected himself the voice of the people. And as you can see, this is the first year of his journal, the cover, the second year. And to a friend, he said, Husisapile glitters over the Armenian shrine with resplendent rays of happiness on one's heart and incurable pain in the heart of another. For patriots, it's a source of glory. For the unpatriotic, shame and embarrassment. So he was using his journal as a real organ for expressing criticism, partly because he saw himself as a sort of a beginning of a new tradition. So I think I will leave it at that and take questions. So go ahead, please.
Thank you for your talk. This guy, Nazarian, seems like he's pretty radical. He's taking on the church.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Hello? Okay. This person, Nazarian, who started that magazine that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but you do. He seems like he's a pretty radical fellow for the times, but it seems like, based on some of the quotes, he's taking on the church, not merely just, I'm not saying he's trying to eliminate it, but he sees it as a real danger to society, to Armenian culture. I'm wondering, was his magazine considered radical, and did it have much of a following? And I see it ended in 1864. What kind of people were buying this magazine, and did it have a huge circulation, or what?
So his initial hope was that he would have 600 subscriptions. He was hoping to get started, but he initially actually started, in fact, with 300. So just to give you a sense of the scope of readership, what was really critical about his journal is that he had a lot of people that later became really important figures in the Armenian literati. People like Ghazaros Aghayan, who was a student in Moscow, was actually doing some typesetting for him. Mikhail Nalbandyan used Husisapile as a place to publish a lot of his works. Sambat Shah Aziz was really considered Nazarian a mentor. So there were a lot of people that were really plugged into his work that later became important movers in this, the literati movement of the later 19th century. Grigor Artruni, for example, actually mentioned Husisapile often, and he's also, he's one of the journals I look at, started later in 1872. He didn't contribute.
Regular contributors to Husisapile?
All but Grigor Artsruni he did not contribute, but it's clear in his writings that he was familiar with it. Everybody was familiar with Hüsrev Sabhal. I think that's partly because Nazarian was someone who was able to. He was a very good polemicist. He was able to really establish the stark alternatives between light and dark, and you can see this imagery gets at that. And so he created a lot of pro-clerical enemies in competing journals like Meru Hayastani, Bee of Armenia. But for example, I mean here, so this is actually just, again, sort of looking at parallels in the imagery. You have a 1733 publication by the Mechitaris of the Bible in classical Armenian, and you have, Sahak Bartev and Mesrop Mashtos. These are these 5th century sort of founders of Armenian literary tradition, the alphabet. So you look at the 1913 collected works of Nazarian, you have the same imagery of Sahak Bartev and Mesrop Mashtos sort of connecting to this tradition of Nazarian as sort of a new, and in fact, he's really, I believe, one of these first to articulate part of what he saw himself as was a person who was starting a tradition with others to really question who has authority over the Armenian tradition, religious tradition included. And so he wrote a lot about how these 5th century clerics, he called them clerical elites, Paftos, Buzand, a lot of these 5th century writers, he portrayed them as parallel to what they were trying to do, because what the original spirit of enlightenment in the 5th century was a movement for translating, creating an alphabet, proselytizing, the Bible throughout Armenian communities, having 40 scholars that would travel to Alexandria, to outside of historic Armenian territory to gain their knowledge. And so a lot of people actually portrayed, for example, Nazarian's travels to Dorpat as sort of a new oasis, a new place to begin. So he really tried to put himself in line with that tradition. And so I think for that he really gained a lot of attention, because that is pretty radical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. A couple of things. One, the name of the newspaper is very telling, I would think, right? Light from the north, Northern Lights,
Northern Glen, yeah.
right? And so the question I would have is his relationship with Russia. This is an interesting period, 1859 to 1864. It's a little bit of an opening in Russian politics. You can discuss things in a way that you won't be able to after about 1863 because of the Polish uprising and there are certain peasant revolts and a number of other things happen. So I would like to know about that. And then the second question related, I think, is it seemed to me that these intellectuals are making a run for the money. That is, the community, insofar as it's a community, is dominated by the church. And these guys are a challenge to that, right? Especially given what you read to us. So how were they received by the church, and were they active? So you got the Russian government on one side you've got to be careful of. And on the other side, you've got the establishment of the community, right? And you're probably all fighting for a small audience, educated Armenians, the bourgeoisie in Tiflis or whatever. That's my question.
Yeah, and actually it's related to what you were originally asking. 1864 is the year Nazarian had no intent in closing up his journal. It was actually forced in by censorship. And that is because a lot of the leading clerical-related journals, pro-clerical, namely Meru Hayastani is the Bee of Armenia, is sort of one of the key players in this, actually had a hand in colluding and getting it closed. And there are letters actually where they wrote to the government, I don't remember which official, so they played an active part in getting it closed. In terms of the Russian influences, as I said, as an Orientalist scholar, it's huge, and that's where he got his place. The Hraparakachos, I think, I'm not sure about the origins of this term, but Hraparakachos is public speaker, and it's very much parallel to the publicist, the Russian publicist, the same kind of role, and Belinsky comes to mind. Belinsky is someone that very, very clearly influenced Nazarian. And you can see it in their works. And I have a few passages in my book where I try to trace that out. But this understanding of sort of the true religious faith, spirituality, as being hijacked by a corrupt church is something that Belinsky talked about a great deal. And I think Nazarian really took his cue from there. It's interesting, though, that he took his cue also from broader intellectual traditions. The Young Germany tradition in the, Heinrich Heine, who was an exiled German Jewish scholar living in Paris and writing satire. He actually has an article about Heinrich Heine in Jussi Pile. He talks about Moses Mendelssohn and the idea of this Jewish intellectual that's reformist, that's trying to reform the faith as, using rational principles and of mathematics, and there's a whole trend in Germany. He was very aware of that tradition as well. Other Russian scholars, I think he lived in Moscow, and I'm sure that, Uvarov actually personally wrote to him and sent him, the Minister of Education at the time, sent him a few hundred rubles so he would continue his writing. And there's actually in English a book, Whitaker, Professor Whitaker wrote about that. She actually has that quote.
Yeah, now see, if you mention Uvarov is a reactionary, he's a right wing, right? He's official nationality. He's the one, very pro-Tsarist. And you mentioned Karamzin, also pro-autocratic and so forth. So what is he getting from those guys? If he's dealing with those guys, and yet Nalbandian is close to him, who gets arrested and exiled by the regime because he's too radical, it's a funny position to be in.
Yeah, I think that he was, and I think that's the interesting duality about, he was able to use Russian institutions for his own purposes. And there's only a certain extent that he was able to do that. He could only go so far. And I see him as someone in a unique moment in this period that you mentioned, in this 60s, 1850s, and late 50s and 60s, where you were able to actually try to reconcile this understanding of imperialism, Russian imperialism, and a multi-ethnic empire where you can sort of carve a niche for yourself. And I think it's very interesting, and that Uvarov clearly was using him as someone that he wanted to recruit to sort of further the administration of the empire, to teach, Farsi, Georgian language, Armenian in these Orientalist outposts, Kazan and others, to create a whole cadre of people that would go and administer the empire. That's really why he got the opportunities that he got. But at the same time, as you said, he creates this very sort of a point of no return where he really, the vision that he had was never, I think he was very deeply ambivalent in the end, because what he really sort of supported was cultural autonomy. He never spoke about political independence. And so, for example, let me just, and there's very quickly, I can even just show you this quote. This is 3 years before he died. I think this is actually very different type of language. I found this in one of the letters he wrote to a friend, which is, I think, deeply honest portrayal of where he found himself, with no journal, teaching, but pretty much quieted. And you can read this, but I think it's a very sort of telling quote. The political machinations and where the Caucasus stood in this. So, does that answer your question? Anything else?
Okay. I will not ask a question. I will just say a few words of praise, because I've read your book, and it's very good. Compared to the other transaction books, I haven't read Fuad Dundar's yet, so that's out. It's the best so far. But what I really liked in what you have done, and I hope more people will try to do that, is that you have used the large amount of footwork that has been done in Armenia over the years. And Nazarian, of course, has been a relatively lucky person, because even in Stalinist times, you still could publish books about him. And next to Apovian and Nalbandian, he comes a close second. And then, of course, you have used all that English language, historiography of the Russian Empire and European nationalism, etc., and tried to put them together. And I think it really raises a lot of questions. And myself, as a pure historian, I have things interesting in it. I know that for anthropologists, for history of development of anthropology, it has. I recommended it to some friends in Armenia. They weren't as much impressed as I were, but they were not critical. They simply said that it's not as original as you think it is. So, but since I have not read the other works, maybe that. But overall, I think it's a very, very good work. Just one question. I know a lot is coming out in Armenia, and I'm not able to keep track of what's coming out. I know that there is a reevaluation of that 4 levels of thought thing that they had, clerical feudal group, the national conservative group. There comes Nazarian's group, the Liberal Democrats, and then, of course, the Revolutionary Democrats, which were Apovian and the others. Now, that one is being shaken up, I know. There are lots of people who are trying to reevaluate, give more credit to what is called the National Conservative Group, although, as far as I know, not a single book. Has anything changed about Nazarian, or is there interest on him in the last 20 years? Because I haven't come across anything, but perhaps you would know.
I would not be someone who can speak to the contemporary sort of research, the state of the field of history in Armenia, unfortunately. I should just say that straight up.
It's amazing the number of books that are coming out and we're missing them. I don't know about the quality, but the quantity is really a lot in the last few years. We have to not lose track of what's really in quantity-wise what is coming out.
I could say that, as far as I know, there have only been 2 biographies, Soviet biographies of Nazarian. One in 1958, Margot Khachaturian, and Rosa Nanumyan published one in 1972 or 3. And she actually has done a lot to publish his collected correspondences, selected works that came out, say, I think in 1999 or thereabouts. As far as any recent work on Nazarian, I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if maybe anyone else is. So, unfortunately.
Well, I want to take up one expression you had regarding his cultural orientation rather than political, although at the end he gets there. I have a different take on his relationship to the church. That is, although he's critical of the church and says must be reformed, but the church still remains in his thought the central Armenian institution.
Yes.
This is the basic reality.
Yes.
That is, he's not talking about a territorial nation, he's talking about an extraterritorial nation represented by the church, and he's upset that the church is not as progressive as it should be. But he's still taking the church as the primary vehicle for change. So the nation, the cultural awakening and whatever else is required in order for Armenians to march with time will be through the church as far as that period is concerned. Subsequently, obviously here he's focusing on the nation and he's already progressed. But I think it is essentially a conservative position.
I wouldn't disagree with that take. I think that, in my view, that is part of, he's extremely critical, there's no doubt about it, but in my view, he is a deeply religious person, and he doesn't so much promote Protestantism, although he gets close to that in some articles in his periodical, in Hüsisapile. He still is, I think, the crux of what motivated him to become a scholar is this belief in what does Enlightenment represent to Armenians. And so he goes back to an earlier tradition. So the church is a central part of his thinking, and religion as well. But he separates religious faith and scripture, and actually was a supporter of the Bible societies that were translating in vernacular the Bible in various languages. And he actually himself tried to do that. And he has religious instruction for children, published in 1853. So he definitely believed that religion was critical for Armenian identity. I think that the criticism really comes from how disappointed he was in what the church, where it was and where it could be and where its origins are. And there are actually, I won't say them now, but there are actually quite a lot of quotes that really show this sort of what could have been and the trajectory that he believes. And that's really what gave him the fuel to actually pursue this very high-minded idea that he is a leader of this tradition, is because he believed that faith is for everyone, and he's someone that's going to allow this Armenian identity to flourish in the guise of a true faith, of religious faith, of Christian faith. And the church is holding that back from where it could be. That is my reading. I'm not sure if I think it's. I mean, I definitely.
Well, that's. I have no quarrel with that. I may put it somewhat differently. The tension here is that he's positing the problem of the nation, albeit a cultural nation. On the other hand, selecting the church as the vehicle through which the nation will change, and that, at the end, is not possible. Because the nation, with a history, with a culture, is beyond the church, although the church is the only institution that's left. So that at the end, he has to make a choice, and I think when you use the term ambivalence, at the end it is the ambivalence as to whether, in fact, it is the church that must do it. That's why a lot of these thinkers ended up with a political nation, territorialized, seeing that the rest of it doesn't make sense, it doesn't go anywhere.
And as you were saying earlier in your lecture this morning, when you look at the socialist sort of movements that developed, I mean, I tried when I was looking at this to separate that and not look at all with hindsight of what happened as the next step. I tried to look at them as sort of their separate tradition in their own right, but it's very clear that the questions that they open up and the criticism they open up is taken to another level.
Limits. I think we should remember that the church was not recognized as the leader of the Armenians in Russia. It's not like the Ottoman Empire, where the church represented the Armenians. In the Russian Empire, the church was just a religious institution. And if you remember the Palagenia, it really denuded the church of all its power. Now, these people see that this is the only institution left, but with no power, no influence whatsoever. Even the parish schools were barely controlled by the church. But there are no other institutions to turn to. And they themselves become institutions. Nazarian, Nalbandian, really, these are people who attracted the public opinion. That's because the church could not play, was not allowed to play any role. So if it exercised any influence, it was by inertia. It was in the population's mind, the Armenians' mind, that this is our church, this is the role it has played all the time. But it was no longer playing that active a role. So you see, and then there is, of course, you spoke about German influence, but there is the Pan-Slavic movement there. Absolutely. You spoke of Karamzin, and the linguistic dimension is very important for him. He and Batganyan and the third one, they played a very important role in making modern Eastern Armenian the modern standard. And that was for a reason. And I mean, it's the same thing happened among the Western Armenians, but it was a protracted, very difficult sort of struggle. Here it was a very smooth thing, because I think the intelligentsia thought like Karamzin. You write the way you speak, and then you speak the way you write. And Karamzin plays a very, very important role here. So you can say something about the church, yeah, but it was not allowed to play the role it usually played.
I think there's an irony there, because after 1836, they stopped being this sort of moral nucleus, while at the same time their powers of monitoring the population heightened. I mean, that's part of the deal of what the Palagenia allowed them to do. So as they gain, to a certain extent, more sort of administrative control, you could argue that, but really there wasn't that much outspoken criticism of the church until the 50s. I mean, unless there's something that I'm leaving out now.
Well, the church was protected by the Russian establishment, but was not given any power within the community.
Mm-hmm.
So there were traditional powers, though, it had and it kept.
What?
The,
What traditional power?
Power of the priest.
I like what you two fellows said, what he said, and her lecture. I can actually put the pieces of the puzzle together thanks to this Q&A and see that they're not necessarily contradictory. That I've got a better idea of exactly what's going on in Armenia during this period, and I don't see any of the things that each of you have said that is a contradiction. I actually think that it's all possible, and each point is valid.
Exclusive, right.
Yes. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Brilliant.
Given that the Armenian community was dispersed among the Russian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond, did Nazarian's influence and his contacts extend very much beyond the Russian Empire?
I don't believe so. I know that he was aware of the newspapers that were being published in the Ottoman Empire and commented on them. So I think there maybe on an individual level there was connections, but in terms of, I mean, it was very hard to get a reading of what the audience for his works were beyond the intellectuals that actually wrote about it. So it's hard to say what the impact would be. In Iran, I know that that's where he originally was from, but I didn't come across anything that discussed his impact in the in Iranian communities. Later journals like Grigor Artsruni's, he was very interested in developing common relationships and having correspondences. In fact, he had correspondences from all over, from Europe, from the Ottoman Empire, from throughout Russia. And he was very interested in bringing that on a local, national, very cosmopolitan level. All of that voices were represented in his journal. But that comes later, 1872 and onwards. Yes, Dr.
He
Rose?
did not make an effort to reach out to the Western Armenians.
Yeah.
The others did. For instance, Batganyan was very, very popular among the Western Armenians. How it came across, we don't know really, but they were aware of his poetry that called on self-defense, etc., etc. And he, sitting at the comfortable cities in Russia and benefiting from the enmity between the two empires, he was very anti-Ottoman, and it did get through the border, even though there were no close relations. But then Artsruni, though, was much more popular, and that's because some Western Armenian writers popularized his name, and he was very well known among the Western Armenians. And he also made an effort to be known because he had plans.
Yeah. And you had Rafi's works, this eyewitness accounts of the communities that were being sent in. So I think, would it be fair to say that at that period you had a much greater sort of correspondence, relationship, communication from the 1870s onwards?
Yeah, there was actually border crossing, so to speak. Formally, there were no relations between the two halves of the Armenian people, but there were people who went back and forth.
Yeah.
And the Nazarian school in Erzurum is a good example of that.
Yeah.
And so there was some traffic.
Yeah, there's actually very interesting, I think one of the most interesting writers, Alexander Yeritsyan, he was actually writing in Russian articles about sort of archaeological digs in the Caucasus in Imperial Russian journals. And as the Russian army was entering sort of Ottoman territory, he actually accompanied them and had eyewitness accounts, sort of a travel journal of what he saw that was published in the 80s, I believe. So, yeah.
This was all publicized.
Yeah.
Well, just let me add to that Nalbandian also had the opportunity to meet the elite in Constantinople when he was sent on a mission tracking a certain will in India. And Soviet Armenian literary studies have focused on that kind of links a lot. It seems that Nazarian did not really try that, while all the other names are slightly later than this period that you were mentioning. Something which really dawned on my mind now entirely. When the Soviet Armenian government made the books, textbooks for diaspora Armenian schools, and my generation studied Armenian through those books, Nazarian is not there. While I remember that in the Eastern Armenian books, in the Soviet, I think he is there. I don't know why that decision was made or whatever. I don't know, it's a far-reach kind of conspiratorial thing. But usually people who are of Ottoman Armenian, Western Armenian origins haven't had that much exposure to Nazarian, the way a person of middle-level education in Eastern Armenia would know him. From the textbooks and from the many books that you said are available in bookstores and libraries about him. So this is a very interesting kind of thing, probably to be explored in that sense. Besides that, of course, in Eastern Armenia, the impact that he had on mentoring the young Mikhail Nalbandian and all the others are all well-known facts. But this is something that why he doesn't appear among the Western Armenians that much is something interesting.
And I think because he was not a writer. The others were writers. I mean, Nalbandian, etc.
He was a yeah. But he was very aware of the Mkhitaris, the Catholic congregation. He wrote quite a lot about them. And he was very well read on Armenian literature and historical works that were out there. And he used that as a platform for critiquing the tradition.
Very popular among the Eastern Armenians. Abovyan, he dreamed about setting up a congregation like that.
Yeah.
He too.
I didn't know
that. And now he's promoted as the champion of spoken Armenian.
Yeah.
The idea was for him and to many who championed the cause was to cultivate, to sort of develop the language and gradually bring it closer to classical Armenian. So there is many things that are not pursued to the end. So Abovyan is seen as the champion of modern Armenian, but that was a temporary thing. He hoped that it would lead back to classical Armenian. So influence of Mkhitaris is there. That's one of the things that manifests itself.
Yeah. And Nazarian actually wrote one of his works in Garbutt, I think in part to prove that he could do it, that he was well read in Any other questions?
I can't help it because this is so fascinating. First, I want to second what Ara said earlier about in his first remark, that this is a wonderful book, and it fills a spot that's been left blank. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, as someone who's worked in nationalism for a long time, for me, these guys are the people who make the nation. That is, who raise a kind of ethno-religious community to self-consciousness in a way and say, this is the way you can be shaped. And there is a contest. The way I would, and this is an interpretation, but the way I would see 19th century Russian Armenian history is a contest between three elements. The church, which is dominant early on, and which is, I guess I disagree with Kevork to some extent, institutionalized in one form or another, and you can see them having power or not having power. It's a matter of the half cup. The cup is full or not full, half cup, whatever that saying is. So they're institutionalized. So the church on one hand, which has relations with the Russian government, the intelligentsia, which is emerging and is setting a challenge to the church eventually. I mean, you think later, they're these people who are saying really awful things about priests and about the church. You know, maybe Nazarian is a liminal figure, somewhere in between, but it gets worse, and then you get into revolutionaries. So that's the second group, which is challenging. And the third is the bourgeoisie, sort of Tiflis, the class with money, industry in Baku and so forth, who also have claims and who others are going to contest for, because they're the ones who have the wherewithal. That's the way of seeing it. But what you've contributed, and we so regret that you're going to become a wealthy lawyer instead of a poor scholar, is filling your people. Kevork's dissertation is one place. Sarkis Mavonian did some work, but didn't publish anything, really one article, that we're working on this early period. And it seems to me one has to go back to that to understand where this understanding of Armenia, not as a religious community, but as something that fits into a modern trajectory, right, comes out. And archaeology is part of it, right? Archaeology is used by nationalists to put feet on the ground, right? If you can find the bones, if Armenia is the first place where we have leather shoes, how do you like that? First leather shoes in Armenia.
Absolutely.
The oldest leather shoe, right? Then you have a claim to that land. You know, I mean, what is Israel has a big archaeological project, right? They got to get there before anyone else, and you know, and so the Palestinians are stopping them from digging because that's competition. And so this Mar and all of these guys were also, you know, whether they were self-consciously nationalists or not, they were helping that cause. And the Georgians and Armenians fought over that, exactly over that as well. Anyway, I'm talking too much, but a wonderful talk.
Okay, any other questions? If not, then let's give a hand to. Thank you.